Hi everyone. So here we are once again looking at the extracts for F585 Global Economy Unit, and today I just wanted to talk to you about extract 3 once again, which refers to two key phrases, one of them being trade creation and one of them being trade diversion. It's very likely that you will get either an analysis question or a comment question, which will probably require you to draw a diagram. And I have in front of you the OCR GCE A-level textbook, and I'm just going to turn in this textbook to a section which contains the diagram which you may need to draw. So here we go. Just get this in properly. I hope you like the new setup here. I've had this set up professionally, so hopefully the presentation will be a little bit better. So we're looking here in this particular textbook, we're looking on page 273, and we're looking at this diagram here, figure 10.15. Now you can use this diagram to illustrate the concepts of trade creation and trade diversion. You've got a little bit of an explanation here, but I would like to maybe just go through this diagram and break it down step by step and hopefully maybe clarify just what's written in this particular section. So let me just do that straight away. So here's our starting point. Just focus this in properly. Oops. So this is our diagram for trade creation and trade diversion. So once again, this is a micro diagram rather in a macro paper. We're starting off simply with the normal micro labels, price and quantity, and we have a supply curve and we have a demand curve. The supply curve is for the supply of a particular product within the UK, and the demand curve is for the demand for that particular product within the UK. Now we are assuming in the first instance that the UK is not a part of the European Union. And so we're going to look at what happens when the UK decides to import a good. In this case the good is lamb, I'm using the textbook example. What happens when the UK decides to import a good from, in this instance, New Zealand? We're assuming that New Zealand is a very efficient producer of lamb, and so the price on the world market is very cheap. So let me just annotate this diagram for you to add in the price of New Zealand lamb. Okay, so here we have the price of New Zealand lamb. As you can see, the price of New Zealand lamb very competitive and well below the equilibrium price which is achievable within the UK. It is possible for UK producers to compete with New Zealand lamb, but only up to a point. And I'm sure you're aware, UK producers can produce and compete all the way along this supply curve, up until they get to here. So UK producers can compete until this point. But beyond that point, as you can see from the supply curve domestically in the UK continues to rise, and so the cost of supplying the good in the UK greatly exceeds the cost of buying it from New Zealand. Now of course we're going to assume that products coming from New Zealand are subject to tariffs, and as you know, a tariff is a tax on a good or service, and that will cause the price of the lamb coming into the UK to increase. The price of New Zealand lamb coming into the UK with the tariff is this price, PNZ plus T. And the distance between PNZ and PNZ plus T is the size of the tariff. Now, of course, the price coming from the UK, coming from New Zealand is now much higher. And so domestic suppliers are more able to compete. So they can compete all the way up the UK domestic supply curve, all the way up to this point here. Beyond that point, as you can see, the domestic supply curve continues to rise, and so domestic price continues to rise, and so domestic producers cannot compete beyond that point. Because this is not a point of equilibrium, demand and supply are not equal. And I'm just going to annotate onto the diagram the points of demand and supply at a price of PNZ plus T. At a price of PNZ plus T, the supply in the UK is equivalent to Q1. Why is it equivalent to Q1? Because it's the point at which PNZ intersects the domestic supply curve. However, we're not at the equilibrium point, and so supply does not equal demand. At a price of PNZ plus T, demand is equal to this point here, where the domestic demand curve, DUK, cuts the PNZ plus T line. And so we have this curious scenario here where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. Now, of course, how is that solved? That problem would be solved by importing from New Zealand the distance between Q1 and Q2. We know that this amount can be supplied domestically. We can see that on the domestic supply curve, but this distance between the two, that has to be imported. And so I'm just going to label that distance as imports. So that really is our section of trade. Q1 to Q2 is equal to trade. Now, of course, a tariff is a tax. And who collects the tax? The government collects the tax. And so the vertical distance, which the difference between PNZ and PNZ plus T, that is the tax. The difference between Q1 and Q2 is the size of the imports, or the quantity of the imports. And so if we multiply that vertical distance by the horizontal, we are getting the total revenue gained from the tariff. And so one of the reasons governments may choose to introduce a tariff is because they are collecting additional tax revenue, equivalent in this instance to the area A, B, C and D. Now, we want to look at whether or not trade creation and trade diversion is beneficial. And so on this diagram, I'm now going to put on a price for the same product, so for lamb coming from France. So I've added the French price, as you can see, above the New Zealand price. And here I'm assuming that, again, the UK is not part of the European Union, no free trade with France, and so the French product is also subject to a tariff. And you can clearly see here that the reason why we would continue to buy from New Zealand would be because the price of buying from France is more expensive. Okay, so that's prior to regionalisation. So now let's consider what happens whenever a regional trading bloc is formed. The first thing that will happen is that there will be free trade between the member nations. So France will be a member, the EU will be a member, but of course New Zealand will not be a member. And consequently, the price of the French lamb, PF plus T, well, the T section, the tariff, is going to disappear because we have free trade. If you remove the tariff from, say, New Zealand's price, then the price would fall. And so similarly, the price of the French lamb will also fall. So I'm just going to annotate that onto our diagram. So now we have a situation where we are trading with France in a regional trade bloc where there are no tariffs, no protectionist policies, and the price of purchasing from France is now cheaper than importing from New Zealand. And this is where, ladies and gentlemen, we can now see two things in action. We can see trade creation and trade diversion in action. Let's remind ourselves what trade diversion is. Trade diversion says that you switch from buying from a more efficient country outside of the free trade area to a less efficient one within. We know that New Zealand is outside of the area, and we also know that the price from New Zealand is cheaper. And we are now going to switch our purchases to France. Because although France is less efficient, as seen by the higher price in New Zealand, because there is no tariff any longer on the French price, it's actually cheaper to buy from France. UK domestic suppliers can compete to a point, and once again, because we're not at equilibrium, there is a divergence between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And just bear with me whilst I annotate the diagram to that effect. So the UK can now compete up to the point where the PF line crosses the domestic supply curve, which is at point Q3. So that's the point of domestic supply. The point of domestic demand, however, is much greater, obviously, because the price is lower. And so the distance between Q3 and Q4 is now much bigger than the original distance of imported goods, which was Q1, Q2. So Q3, Q4 is now imported, and obviously that is an instance of trade creation because the level of imports have gone up. So it's reasonable to suggest that Q3, Q4 is an illustration to us of trade creation. What about trade diversion? Well, trade has now switched from the more efficient producer outside the bloc, New Zealand, to the less efficient producer inside the bloc, which is France. And so we could annotate on the diagram and show that being trade diversion. As shown. Trade diversion, switching from purchasing at this price to purchasing at this price from France, the higher price. Okay, so that's a basic explanation of that diagram. Now we want to consider the economic welfare gains as illustrated by this diagram. And I'm going to highlight 4 or 5 key areas for you. Okay, let's consider areas 1, 2, 3 and 4 first of all. When we were buying from New Zealand, the area of consumer surplus, and for your, just to refresh your memories, consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve. So at PNZ plus T, the area above price and below demand curve would be that triangle. Now obviously when we reduce the price to PF, the triangle gets bigger and we now move to P from there, PF, to there, to there, if we took that demand curve up to the axes. And so areas 1, 2, 3 and 4 are all areas of enlarged consumer surplus. So clearly the consumer is benefiting from this trade creation, trade diversion, because their consumer surplus has gone up. The government, as we've already mentioned, benefits because they get this area A, B, C and D in the form of a tariff revenue initially. That's before the EU joins, but obviously whenever this tariff is removed and we're now just buying from France without any tariff, then the government isn't earning any tariff revenue either. Area 1 we can also see is an area of loss for producers, because it is an area of loss of producer surplus. You'll remember that producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the going price. So if we consider the initial price PNZ plus T, so there's the price, there's the supply curve, and all of that triangle there would have been producer surplus. Now the price has fallen to PF, and so the producer surplus is now just this triangle. And so we've lost that area, number 1. We've also, as we've said, lost out, the government has lost out, should I say, on area 3, which would have been part of the tariff revenue. And so the areas of gain are area 2, area 4, and the greater area of loss here, the overall loss, is area 5. Now that area, so we're talking about from here to here to here to here, that was previously part of the government's tariff revenue, but obviously that no longer exists, and so the government aren't earning that money any longer. We can see on this particular diagram that areas 2 and 4, the area of that little triangle, the area of that little triangle, is probably less than the area of that rectangle, area 5. And so in this instance it may be the case that the overall gain is outweighed by that overall loss. In order to minimize that effect, what would we want to happen? Well, what we would want to happen is we would want the new country that we are importing from, which in this case is France, we would want that country to be more efficient, because if that country was more efficient, this price line, PF, would move downwards more towards the New Zealand price, and so this area 5 would get smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore these triangular areas would obviously get bigger, and so the area of overall gain would be greater than the area of overall loss. Okay, I think that's all there is to say really on this diagram. And this diagram, let's not forget, this considers the static effects of integration on trade creation and trade diversion. If you look in your textbook, page 273, you'll see the static effects but also the dynamic effects. And the other thing worth mentioning is, as these demand and supply curves, if they were to become more inelastic, then the size of these triangles 2 and 4 also become a lot smaller, and therefore those areas of gain get much smaller as well. Anyway, I hope that's been of help, and I'll see you all again next time.